Let us now consider how we can classify solids in terms of the nature of bonding present in them. This will only be an overview. We are not going to get into rigorous detail. Now, we will also be considering what is known as the cohesive energy. This is the energy that must be added to the crystal to separate all its components into neutral free atoms at rest at infinite separation with the same electronic configuration. So this means that we need to basically find out the energy that represents, we need to find out the term that represents the total energy of the crystal. That's just the cohesive energy. If I sum over that term over all the atoms, I will essentially get this cohesive energy. Now, these are the melting points of elemental solids. You can see that the inert elements here on the extreme right, they have very low melting point, and you have the metals which have got a slightly higher melting point, and then you have materials like carbon, silicon. Carbon particularly has a very high melting point. It's like 3800 Kelvin or so. So that means that each of these bond differently. So the nature of bonding for the inert elements is different from the nature of bonding for carbon, nature of the bonding for lithium, sodium, potassium, etc. Because of the energy needed to dissociate the solid is quite different. The temperature is quite different. These are again a table of cohesive energies. The same argument made for melting points also will apply here. So if you look at this is from Kittel, you can just take a look from the book. So if you look at the cohesive energies for these guys, for these guys, for these guys, they're all quite different. So which means that there are different types of bonding. And also you must have studied about electrovalent bond, covalent bond, ionic bond, and so on and so forth. But the point is that these are not distinct categories like what we study in school. You can always have some kind of combination. You can have some mix and match kind of hybrid is always possible for many solids. Not just for elemental solids, for example, like sodium chloride or any other kind of solids with multiple elements. So we'll start off with the type of bonding in the inert solids, and that's called the van der Waals interaction. For these guys, the cohesive energy is extremely small compared to the ionization energy of the electron. So that means that there is no electron transfer. This is a bonding that occurs without any electron transfer from one atom to the other, unlike the case of covalent bond or the electrovalent bond, or ionic bond. So the simplest way to understand how the van der Waals interaction works is to consider two neutral atoms. Now there can be charge fluctuations in time, that is temporal charge fluctuations in each atom. So a slight deviation from this spherical charge density, momentary deviation would result in a dipole, and that momentary dipole would induce another dipole in the other atom, and vice versa. So these kind of interactions, which are momentary and not obviously not strong, is called the van der Waals interaction. Now to model this interaction, you can consider two atoms, and each of the atoms are thought of as a spring system. This is the nucleus, and that's the electron, and the capital R is the separation between the nucleus, and you have x1 and x2 as the distance of each electron from its own nucleus. Then you can write down the Hamiltonian of this system as this, which is like two harmonic oscillators, and to this Hamiltonian, which we consider as the base Hamiltonian, we add a perturbation, which is the electrostatic perturbation. So you have H1 given by this. This is the repulsion between the two nuclei. This is the repulsion between the two electrons, the attraction of the electron with the nuclei, and so on. So that's the Coulomb interaction energy. We can treat this Hamiltonian H1 as the perturbation to H0. And if you actually did the calculation, we are not going to get into the details here. The first order energy correction would be 0. The second order correction would correspond to the van der Waals potential. So this Hamiltonian will not give you eigenvalues in its present form. Because it's got two position variables. You change that into x plus and x minus, and you rewrite the positions x1 and x2 in terms of x plus and x minus, and then you will be able to get eigenvalues for the Hamiltonian. And you can rewrite that Hamiltonian after the change of variables in this form. Don't worry too much about this. I'm not going to. This is only a overview. I don't expect you to write this down and derive this in this section, just for this section alone. Other sections you have to do the math. In this section I'm just giving you an overview, so don't worry too much about the derivations. As long as you get a flavor for what's happening, it's fine. Now for such a system, you basically have a kind of you'll have a set of quantized energy levels, obviously some complex set of quantized energy levels. All you need to do is consider the lowest state occupied, because we assume that there are we are not going to consider excitations. And then if you find out the 0 point energy for the modified Hamiltonian, and find out how much extra is the 0 point energy compared to two independent oscillators. Two independent oscillators would have 0 point energy of half h cross omega naught. So this would be the 0 point energy of the new systems, omega plus and omega minus, corresponding to the change in variables. So the excess 0 point energy is given by this term, and it scales as 1 by r power 6, the distance between the two nuclei. So it falls off very rapidly, and that term, this potential given by minus a by r power 6, is the van der Waals potential. Of course, the way I have explained it, it makes it very crude. If you did it with perturbation theory, it would be much more rigorous. Now, band structure calculations of inert gases have been done, and you can calculate the form of the wave functions, the physical functions, the spatial variations of the wave functions, and you can see here, this is one lattice site of neon and another lattice site, and you can look at the wave function overlap. You can see that there is practically no overlap, and that means that there is no if I arrange a lattice of inert gases, you can basically have the charge cloud of one ion. This is the ion and the charge cloud, ion and the charge cloud. They're just sitting next to each other, and the charge cloud of one ionic site does not overlap, practically does not overlap with the charge cloud of the other lattice site. This is completely in contrast to what will happen in case of covalent bonding. In case of covalent bonding, you will have sharing of electrons. You will have the electronic charge densities will be maximum in the middle of the two ions. And in case of ionic bonding, one electron will actually go from one lattice site to the other, and that's the extreme case. It's even worse. And in the case of metallic bonding, in the case of metals, you basically have all the valence electrons charge density would be smeared all over the lattice, and it will be common to all the ions. So this is the most extreme case, the van der Waals interaction, where the charge densities basically don't overlap at all. Now, in addition to the attractive term, there is a repulsive term due to the Pauli exclusion principle. So if I have basically I have an inert system, so it's all the shells are filled for both the atoms which are trying to form bond, and there are no states for the electrons to go. So because of the Pauli exclusion principle, these two atoms will tend to stay away from each other. Beyond a certain point, you cannot push them, and you can see this from this picture here. So this is an extreme example where you try to fuse two hydrogen atoms to form helium. Of course, that's not possible in the lab sense. So you have hydrogen 1s upspin and hydrogen 1s downspin. If you try to combine them together, this should be easily possible, because there are two states, and that two states can accommodate both the upspin and downspin, and you should be able to theoretically do it. Now if you had a case where both the spins of the hydrogen atoms are one as upspin, one as upspin, and if you try to put them together, then the upspin cannot sit in the 1s state, because already there is one upspin. The other upspin has to go to the higher energy state, which is 2s. So so this repulsion due to Pauli exclusion principle ensures that, I mean, there must be an excited state for it, that if there is an empty level, it will be pushed up. That's how the repulsion works for in general for due to Pauli exclusion principle. Now, so in the case of the inert solids, because the base electronic configuration are both filled here, this is also 1s2 2s2 2p6, for example, 1s2 2s2 2p6, then if I bring them together, because of the repulsion due to Pauli exclusion principle, I mean the other electron has to go to the higher energy level. That will take a lot of energy. I mean, that's not usually possible. So they tend to stay away from each other. So in addition to the attractive term, which is the van der Waals term given by minus a by r power 6, and that can be rewritten in terms of other parameters and so on. I don't want to get into what those parameters epsilon, sigma are. There is a repulsive term b by r power 12. This b by r power 12 is essentially determined empirically. You check if it matches with the experiment and you adjust the power. And if I add them together, b by r power 12 minus a by r power 6, that's called the Lennard-Jones potential, and the Lennard-Jones potential has this kind of a form. You can see how steep the repulsive term is. That's because it's extremely difficult to take one electron and put it up to the to an unoccupied level. That just usually doesn't happen. I mean, the system will just tend to stay away from each other rather than that happening. So that's why the repulsion due to the exclusion principle is extremely steep. And what is more important is, look at the attractive potential. This is the minimum. Now, this attractive potential is very, very shallow. It's extremely shallow because the van der Waals force is very weak. I mean, you barely are able to form a bond. And you can, if you just give it a little bit of excitation, it will break. The one atom will just fly off on the other side. So that's the basic form of the Lennard-Jones potential for inert solids. Now you can sum over given the Lennard-Jones potential, you can sum over the entire solid. You can say I'm sitting in one ion I, and I want to find out the contribution to the Lennard-Jones potential from all other ions J, and I do a summation. Of course, the summation is complex and tricky. I don't want to get into the details here, but that's essentially how you compute the cohesive energy. So that is an expression for the cohesive energy, the amount of energy needed to break up the solid at absolute zero and zero pressure. And of course, given the Lennard-Jones potential, you can calculate the position where you get the minimum, etc. You can take the derivative and so on. Those are standard maths which follow. Now, the next kind of bonding we are going to consider is ionic bonding, and this is the standard sodium chloride that everyone is aware of. So, one electron from the sodium atom travels to the chlorine atom. So, it's a complete shift of electronic densities. In the inert gas case, there is no shift of energy densities. In this case, you can see that the site of the Cl minus is fatter. I mean, you have the ion which receives the electron is fatter in charge density compared to the other ion, and that's the kind of bond you form. Obviously, one is a positive ion, one is a negative ion. You have an electrostatic interaction. So that's the basic, the most easy to understand bond that can be formed. And you can create these kind of pictures from X-ray diffraction. You can calculate the charge densities, and you can create these kind of contour maps. And you can see that the charge density on the site of the chlorine is much bigger than the site of the sodium. And the kind of potential that you write here is, this first term is the basic electrostatic potential. It can either be positive or repulsive or attractive. That is, it's repulsive between Na plus and Na plus, and attractive between Na plus and Cl minus. Then you empirically add this repulsion term. The attractive term is given by here. Of course, it can also be sometimes repulsive for certain ions. But when this is attractive, there's also a repulsion term, because you can't arbitrarily keep decreasing the separation between Na plus and Cl minus. At some point there will be a repulsion because of Pauli exclusion principle again. That repulsion is shown by that empirical term. Deriving such terms ab initio is very difficult, so even in advanced course they don't generally do it. And again, you can sum over all the ions from with a reference site I. You can sum over all other ionic sites, and you get that kind of a form, which is the cohesive energy, the total energy for n sites. And this term here, you can pull out all the d squared 4 pi epsilon 0. You can pull it out, and this term here, which basically depends on the geometry of the lattice, that's called the Madelung constant. Then we come to the covalent bond. There's a very nice quote in Kittel. He says, carbon gives biology, silicon gives geology and semiconductor technology. And what is most interesting is Pauli controls pretty much everything. The Pauli exclusion principle controls pretty much everything. With biology, geology, semiconductor technology, superconductivity, pretty much everything in the universe. Now, the simplest way to understand how the covalent bond works is to consider the hydrogen molecule. So I have this hydrogen is just one proton and one electron. So H and H, if I bring them together, now to form a bond, to form a stable bond, I must have the electrons, one electron from here and the other electron from here in the center, some kind of a combined state in the center. You have a charged cloud in the center. So this is negative here. So the positive ion gets attracted from this side, and the positive ion gets attracted from that side. Then you form a stable bond. That's essentially how the covalent bond works. So you have a half-filled orbital on both sides. The electrons go to the center, and it's or partially filled, not half-filled, partially filled orbital. And then the electrons move to the center, and you have a charged cloud in the center, and the ions get attracted to it. Now, why partially occupied states are necessary is slightly complex question that I will not get into at this moment, but that's just think of it as a moment for the moment as an empirical observation. Now, obviously, because of the nature of this bonding that you just saw, the bond is strongly directional. It depends on where the electrons pile up, in which direction in space the electrons pile up. Now, what is more interesting is you can't just arbitrarily take two electrons and bring them together and say I have an electron cloud in the center. The spins of the electron matter. That's where the Pauli exclusion principle comes in. And in the case of hydrogen atom, if I have those two electrons, then if I want to form a stable hydrogen molecule, then the two electrons in the electron clouds must have opposite spins. They must have, one must be spin up and one must be spin down. Then only they can spend time close to each other. We can show, and this is some derivation that you will do probably in StatPhi, if the spins have the same distance, same spin, if there are two if the two electrons have the same spin, both are up and or both are down, then they tend to avoid each other. Then they tend to have this kind of a configuration. They tend to avoid each other. This is not a stable bond. So you call this as the bonding orbital, and this is the excited state, and this is called the anti-bonding orbital or the anti-bonding state. So for the bonding orbital, which is the stable state, the electrons will be one spin up and one spin down, and so you have basically a diamagnetic system because that's a system. Hydrogen is paramagnetic, but if you form a bond, then it's a filled shell system, and that's non-magnetic, or it's diamagnetic. It's non-magnetic with respect to an externally applied field, but it's internally it's got an ability to repel the changing magnetic fields, and that's the diamagnetism. Again, this magnetism is a subject that you will discuss in condensed matter 2. I don't want to get too much into it. So now this is the energy as a function of intermolecular separation for hydrogen. This is the lower energy state, the bonding orbital state, where the spins are opposite to each other. This is the anti-bonding state. You can see how much higher in energy it is, where the spins are parallel to each other. You can see the charge densities are on the either side, and you can see the charge densities are in the center here. And the central line is a classical derivation made without accounting for Pauli exclusion principle. So you can see this is closer to experiment. Obviously, you can see how much lower in energy is the ground state is because of the exclusion principle. Now, if you take the bond length of chlorine, it's Cl2, it is 2 angstroms. That's because chlorine is 3p5, and one 3p5 and another 3p5, you can form some kind of hybridization. I don't know what hybridization you call it, but you can have a covalent bond, and because of the covalent bond, the two chlorine ions can come close to each other, and therefore the bond length is shorter compared to argon. Elemental argon has got a bond length of about 3.76 angstroms. That is because argon on either side is 3p6 and 3p6. You can't have any kind of bond. You can't have ionic or covalent or whatever. Therefore, they tend to stay away from each other. Generally, Pauli exclusion principle again is governing the bond distances here, because you have an empty state, and that you can understand why you need an empty state in terms of this, because you need one level for the electron to flip over. In the case of hydrogen, for example, you had there's 1s can occupy 2 electrons, can accommodate 2 electrons. You have 1 electron with 1s upspin. Then the other state is empty, and the other electron can flip its spin and sit there. The other electron can become downspin, and that is one of the that is the reason why partially occupied states is necessary for bonding. Of course, rigorously proving it would take a little bit of doing, that we will not get into. Empirically, it's just because of the intuitively it's just because of the exclusion principle. So it's again the exclusion principle at work here. It's not allowing the argon atoms to come close to each other relative to the case where there is covalent bonding, in the case of chlorine, or ionic bonding. So in the case of in the case of diamond, you have something special. So diamond is 1s2, 2s2 and 2p2. Generally you expect only these two electrons the 2p2 electrons to participate in the covalent bond. But what happens is that this one electron, because the 2s and 2p are not very far away from energy in terms of energy, one electron gets transferred to 2p, and you have, this should be 1s2, 2s1, 2p3. I wrote the 3 here. I'm sorry about that. This should be 2p3. So one electron transfers to the p orbital from the s orbital, and therefore you have one electron in this that can participate in covalent bonding, and 3 electrons here. So you have that's why you have the sp3 hybridization that you must have read in school, and it forms a tetravalent structure like that, as shown there. You have 4 electrons combining to form a covalent bond, and that 4 electrons you have a charge density cloud which looks like that, and so on. Then we have the metallic bonding. This is a very weird kind of bonding where you have the electron gas, and in this electron gas you can imagine the ions, the sodium ions sitting, and the nature of the bonding is kind of it's not intuitive among every others compared to all other bondings in solids. It's quite non-intuitive, and this is the reason is that if you look at this is nickel here, and this is the spatial extents of the 3D or 3D wave functions and the 4s wave function. If you look at the 4s wave function, the 4s wave function extends over. If you look at this is the distance, and if you look at nickel's solid, this would be the near neighbor, next near neighbor, next near neighbor, R1, R2 and R3. So you can see that the s orbital extends over not just the neighbor, it extends to 2 or 3 lattice sites. From any given lattice site, the s orbital extends to 2 or 3 lattice sites. And in the case of sodium, which is shown here, and if you have 2 lattice sites here, if you note, if you can trace, this is a picture from Ashcroft, if you can trace the 3s orbital, the 3s orbital spikes up like this and goes like that. And this 3s orbital spikes up like this and goes like that. And you can see complete overlap in the center. The 3s orbital of one sodium site completely overlaps with the 3s orbital of the other sodium site. So that's the basic nature of metallic bonding is kind of long range, and in some sense it behaves like a covalent bond, but it is not directional because the electrons cannot be confined. In the covalent bond, the electrons are confined to within the bond. Here in the metallic bond, the electrons, you don't know, once you form the solid, I can't say that electron came from this lattice site. You don't know that valence electron came from this lattice site. That's not possible because they can travel pretty much anywhere in the solid. And that's why it's kind of weird to explain it is electrostatic in nature, but it is also itinerant in the sense that you have moving electrons holding a lattice of ions together. And you can imagine, so suppose I have this, I talked about this overlap of the 3s orbital in sodium. If I can extend this overlap like this to other ionic sites, let's say in one dimension, and it forms like a sine wave. It forms that overlap. If I ignore all this fluctuations of the wave function close to the ionic site, if I just focus on this overlap here and it falls down and then it picks up again like this and so on, that looks like a block wave function. So you can imagine why a free electron, when placed in a periodic lattice, in the case of metals at least, still has got that periodicity of a plane wave, still behaves like a plane wave, but it has got a periodicity of the lattice, and that it can be crudely understood from this kind of this picture, which gives you the huge huge overlap of excuse me, I get distracted, huge overlap of the valence state. So fine, so we'll stop here. In the next video, we'll start talking about the failures of a static lattice model and what we can do to understand that.